Alright, folks, the news of the day today is one of the most spectacular things that I have seen since I started paying attention to politics. We're at a point right now where both the left and the right agree and believe that the federal government has way too much power, and it's time to restructure it so that there's less power in the hands of the Senate and the Supreme Court. I came to this conclusion last week while I was playing around on Twitter. I was looking around and I happened across a tweet from Razorfist, and what he laid out in it was a way to convince the left to disable the powers of the federal government and especially the Supreme Court and put things like legislation and judicial review back onto the hands of more local governments and governing agencies where we have a more direct application in the process. Let's see what Razor has to say. The way forward now is simple. Present a case that can overturn a previous illegal activist Supreme Court decision and seize the left's resultant outrage to neuter the powers of the Supreme Court for all time, so the SCOTUS can never go into business for itself again. I definitely think this is bordering on a genius idea. Like I said when I described the tweet, we have found a way to convince the left to vote for something that we want and take some of the power away from the federal government where it's been gathering and stagnating for 50 years. Now, I want to try really hard not to completely denigrate anybody on the left because I do want to take some time and actually talk to some of these people and see if we can either find common ground or maybe take some of the people off and convince them that the Republican Party isn't as bad as CNN is telling them that it is. But when we look around the internet, especially post Kavanaugh, we start to see a completely reactionary force from left wing outlets out there, and it's mainly driven by their readers and some of the more extreme people on the Democratic left. And if we ignored some of these things, we would be putting ourselves in peril of letting the government fall into the hands of the reactionaries rather than reforming the Democrat Party back into its union roots or eliminating it completely and reforming a brand new party on the left to represent those people and those interests. One of the first things that I found while I was looking around was a Vox article that says it all right in the title: The Case for Abolishing the Supreme Court. And this is just astounding to me in every single way as I look at it. As we scroll down through the article, we sit here, and one of the first things that they bring up is Hamilton, who says that this should have been the least dangerous branch to political rights in the government, and I tend to agree with that. The Supreme Court wasn't meant to legislate, it was just meant to review legislation and make sure that it aligned with the articles of the Constitution and the first 10 amendments that our framers put forward. And of course, any subsequent amendments that came out of that were also subject to the judicial review of any laws that came forward. But now there are people out there that are saying that the court is now a blunt political instrument used repeatedly to undermine the outcomes of democratic governance, which we don't necessarily have a democratic governance, but we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the video. The writers then go on and talk about an interview that they had with a Mark Tushnet, who I'm not completely sure who that is, but as you read through the interview, you realize that Tushnet kind of undermines his own case with this. Tushnet sits and cites several decisions from the Supreme Court and talks about the positive impact that they had on life. And I do tend to agree with a lot of things that he brought up, except for the legislation from the bench that he obviously talked about, which is the most important part of the Supreme Court in the eyes of the left. It was part of the reason that they fought so hard to keep Kavanaugh off the bench on the Supreme Court, because it was assumed that the most important part of the court is to legislate when the legislature can't legislate. And as a constitutionalist, Kavanaugh would not follow that party line and would also change the balance of the court so that the people who did follow that party line were no longer in control. In the wake of Kavanaugh being appointed and nominated to the Supreme Court, the left has been very quick to run out and try and find somebody to blame for the fact that it even happened in the first place. There have been Instagram posts, there have been posts by celebrities, there have been soapboxes and protests and any other sort of democratic resistance out there that essentially boils down into mob rule. And that's come down to the point where people won't even allow you to come out and say the word mob because they fear its negative connotations in modern and polite society. But it was assumed, of course, that no matter what the president did, because he's the evil orange man who is a Democrat himself, but nobody will admit to that, was able to appoint somebody who's going to overturn Roe versus Wade, and it was up to the Senate to stop him or at least hold a confirmation until after the midterms, which, as we've been talking about on this channel forever, was the initial goal from the point that Kennedy retired. They never came out and said it, but it's been obvious in their actions. But following all of this, the new call has come out to completely disband the Senate entirely. While I was scrolling through Instagram, I saw on celebrity accounts the same picture showing up over and over again. I'm sourcing this from Sanctioned Johnny Galecki's account, and let's have a look at what's been shared around Instagram. It's, of course, very cold, very dry statistics as we read. Kavanaugh was nominated by a candidate who lost the popular vote by 3 million plus votes. I'd like to remind everybody that when Mitt Romney ceded the election to Barack Obama was down by about 3 million votes at the time. I do understand the fact that after the final counts came out, Barack Obama wound up winning that popular vote, but at the time that Romney ceded the election, he was down by 3 million votes. But let's continue. The 49 senators who voted no on Kavanaugh represent 181.8 million Americans. The 51 senators who voted yes represent 143.2 million. Our political system is broken. What gets me the most about this kind of post is the fact that the majority of people who are posting it are about my age or even a little bit older. We used to teach civics in this country. I don't know if we teach it anymore, but we used to teach American civics. For me, it was a required 7th grade class. And we learned right away in civics that that's exactly the way the government was supposed to work. The system isn't broken, it's working the way that they designed it to work. With this kind of thing circling around on social media, of course you had to understand that from the left-wing outlets, the articles were going to start flowing about how the Senate is undemocratic, and of course why it matters. This, ironically, is the title of a Vox article that I used to read up on the opinions that are going around the country and what it is that we need to do to ensure that our Constitution stays in place for years to come, so that my children can grow up under the same freedom of the Constitution that I was able to. Let's look at what Vox has to say. The title, of course, is "The Senate is Undemocratic, and It Matters." The article was great because it vocalizes the same kind of sentiment that Galecki's Instagram post put out there for the world to see, and it actually puts some of the views of our Constitution back into there. It gives us something that we can defend against. The article goes through and it shows the voting record of the Senate, and it shows some of the ideals of the Senate and basically some of the statistics of how the Senate has voted versus how it's going now and the will of the larger states in the country, which most people on the left assume is the will of the country. And then it goes on to show the fact that it's a complete crime that there is an equal representation in our Senate between states like Wyoming and states like California. These two states they cite specifically as the smallest and largest states in the Union, and cite the fact that there is a 68-to-1 population ratio between the two of them. And unfortunately for Vox, and fortunately for all of us that are listening to this article and in support of the Senate, that's how the system was designed to work. One of the important things to note is that when the framers designed our system, they had the will of the people in mind. They had come from an absolute monarchy that had limited legislative representation to the monarch, and they knew that they needed to have some sort of will of the people, or the people would revolt off of their new nation and go off and try and form their own nation again. Fortunately, our founders did know the dangers of doing a direct democracy, especially in a land as large as the founders initially wanted our United States to be, and certainly foreshadowing the ideas of how large our nation did wind up being. Direct democracies can work very well in countries with smaller populations. You have to see everybody that you have voted against day in and day out, and the personal aspect of it can sway some of the decisions of the people who are voting and possibly be a partial representative to the rights of the minority. You have to look someone in the eye when you vote to take that person's right away. A direct democracy in a very large country like the one that our founders envisioned is completely unfeasible. A direct democracy at the time would have meant that essentially the will of New York would have taken over and overshadowed the needs of the other 12 states, and that wasn't something that our founders wanted, and it was definitely not something that a state like Rhode Island would have signed on to had that been the only offer that was presented to them. A Bloomberg article that I found spoke to the exact same thing. Now, as you read this article, and I highly recommend it, it's going to be linked in the description below, it's important to stop and think about the fact that the writer, Noah Feldman, is still saying the same leftist talking points and telling us how evil the Senate is and how terrible it is that the Senate is the one that's essentially representing the will of the people, even though it doesn't completely represent the will of the people. But as you read down through this, the writer does understand the way that the system works and what we would have to do if we wanted to change the way the system works and make it population-based in both chambers. In order to change the system over into a system that is population-based in both chambers, we would essentially have to throw the Constitution out and start over, as the equal representation clause in the articles of the Constitution is unamendable. Therefore, we would have to start over and have a convention of states, and we would have to convince states like Wyoming and North Dakota and Montana, and even little teeny tiny states like Rhode Island, who is very population dense, but still can't stand up against its closest neighbor, Massachusetts, to sign on to giving up its representation in our government, essentially allowing New York and California to trample over all of the rest of them and impose their will on everybody. Our system is not broken. Our system is working exactly the way that it was designed to work. And that's important to realize when you look at the demographics and the statistics of the situation at hand. We live in a system where one small part of our large federal government has a chance to represent a dairy farmer in South Dakota the same as a mob of failed actors in California. We have a system where a union worker in Minnesota can expect and get the same kind of representation in Washington as a large amount of bankers in New York State, and especially in New York City. We have a system where people that decide that they don't want to live in cities can still have a voice in the government against people who want to gather up in cities and impose their wills among all of the people in the country, and do so from afar, far away from people that they will never see but still want to impose laws on. This is the way that our founders framed our system, and this is why it works the way that it does. And if you can find a way to revamp the system that's more fair to your liking, but you can still have the same representation, for those of us in farm country, in the middle of country, as you enjoy in your coastal elite huge cities where you do want to impose your will on the rest of us. Lay it out and let's discuss. And let's talk about the way that the system should work. And let's come together and try and find something to compromise on. Unfortunately, we are living in the Great Compromise, and I don't see another way to make it work that way that doesn't heavily favor the large states that are already heavily favored in our government. What do you think about the Supreme Court? What do you think about the government in general? And what do you think about representation among both houses? I always welcome a thoughtful and positive discussion in the comments section below, and especially over on Twitter. That is at edsblogtwitter with a 1 in place of the I. Thanks as always for listening to this show and supporting this channel. And remember, never take the words of bloggers, podcasters, or journalists as gospel. Find all the facts and draw your own conclusions. Take care.
You're always there for me in my